Chapter 9, the Internet, News Media, and Advertising. All right, so Herricks going to give us the Internet, news media, and advertising, give us some worries about each of these, some concerns, some things that critical thinkers should be thinking about, and then some strategies about how to best navigate them. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between the Internet, the news media, and advertising, which we'll see in some of the examples. So first of all, the internet. So what you ideally want to do is find a source with credentials. That would mean that they're a recognized expert from a reputable university with relevant experience. It's not always the case, but that's one of the standards that you would want. And one of the main things you're going to ask yourself is, what type of evidence do they offer? How credible is that evidence? Is it contrary to your background knowledge? Are the sources that they cite publicly available? Are they publicly checkable if they cite any sources at all? And when it comes to these sources and the person or the entity that's providing the information to begin with, are they closely affiliated with a party or an ideology? Is this actually advertising masquerading as news or as objective information? Is it entertainment masquerading as news or objective information? Now, some things you can do. First of all, you can use some different truth checkers. Some people actually think these truth checkers themselves are biased one way or another. Snopes.com, truthicorfiction.com, factcheck.org. Make up your own mind as to whether these are trustworthy. You can test them against other reliable sources. I'm going to recommend a couple of different times, as I have previously in the semester, to gather your information from multiple sources. That way you can balance out and cancel out some of the biases that you're inevitably going to find. Wikipedia used to be a source that professors would laugh at. However, it's not the worst thing in the world. It is true that anyone can edit Wikipedia, but they often have experts that come through over time and take a look at the relevant articles related to their field of expertise. However, the newer articles will not have went through this cycle of scrutiny from the experts. And so the newer an article or the most recently updated an article, the less reliable it would be, all else equal. And you can also check out academic websites, such as for philosophical resources, plato.stanford.edu. Eric thinks it's a good idea to trust universities in general, professional organizations in general. In all cases, you want to contrast them against other sources and decide for yourself using your critical thinking skill as to what to believe and what not to believe, what's more or less credible. Now, under the news media, Eric offers some information here that's very consistent with an old book called Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. And here's a quote from Herrick's book. He says, in order to make a profit, news organizations must have advertisers and they must hold an audience. As a result, reporters and editors may edit their stories so as not to offend corporate owners, advertisers, and audiences. And so the thesis for manufacturing consent is that news sources aren't going to bite the hand that feeds them. If it's the case that one of their primary advertisers is Purina Dog Chow, and they have a reporter that gets a tip that Purina Dog Chow is feeding dogs cockroaches rather than healthy food, well, they may suppress that story. They may decide not to investigate that particular story. They may bury it at the end of a broadcast so as not to erode the trust of that advertiser. Now, it may not be a big deal if you're just talking about Purina Dog Chow, one among many different advertisers that might fund a particular outlet. But what if it's a corporate conglomerate? What if it's a parent company that owns lots of smaller companies and advertises a great deal on your network? You very well could have some pressure from the editors, from the folks on the business side of the news entity that would discourage the investigation of anything that would undermine their financial incentives. You judge for yourself whether or not that would really incentivize or if that would really put a chilling effect in reporters' investigatory instincts, that really would cloud their judgment. But that's the thesis from Manufacturing Consent, and it's also something that Herrick asks us to look out for. Another thing that Herrick includes in his book is related back to a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. And Herrick puts it this way. He says, news organizations are also competing with each other. And as Postman points out, with Netflix, social media, Comedy Central, ESPN, this means audiences need to be hooked and they need to be held. That's interesting. They need to be hooked and they need to be held. And they can do that many different ways. And one of the things they do is they dumb down the coverage big time. Herrick points out in Think with Socrates that a particular topic might deserve an hour-long documentary so that the audience can really get the background information needed to fully understand it in context. But if they were to do that, many viewers with low attention or short attention spans would simply change the channel. They'd flip over to something else, or they would go to their phones and check out social media. And so coverage is often dumbed down and sensationalized to appease viewers' emotions and attention spans. And so if you really care about a topic, you really want to understand the background, you need to seek out news sources that will provide that context. They are out there. I'm going to recommend any because then you might think I'm biased one way or the other, but oftentimes PBS is a decent source. They're going to have some coverage that's more boring, but it's also going to be more methodical. It's going to be have much more context. And you can always judge for yourself what angle they're coming at the issue from. They're always going to have some sort of a perspective, but your view and your perspective is going to be more enriched if you seek out sources like that. And also if you read, that's where most of the really good information is. And last, here's a book that I read whenever I was in college about your age. It's called Toxic Sludge is Good for You, Lies, Damn Lies in the Public Relations Industry. And here's a quote related back to that book from Herricks. It says, reporters are often fed information during news conferences by public relations people. Such packaged information may not always be accurate, and they reflect the individual's or organization's self-interest rather than plain facts. In some cases, slanted information may be all that is presented to the public if a reporter is too lazy or too busy and doesn't dig deeper. Between my undergrad and my graduate school education, I worked for a small town newspaper, the Monroe County Advocate in Sweetwater, Tennessee. And I can attest to the fact that reporters are very busy. They're very much underpaid, and it's not in their financial interest to spend a whole lot of time digging deeper on stories when they're going to get paid a very small amount for each thing that they report. And so if an entity provides to them a fact sheet, here's some information that you can then translate into an article, it's going to be in their just human interest in many cases to take that information and provide it to the public if they don't have good reasons to dig deeper. And many different entities, attorneys, politicians, companies take advantage of this, and they'll push out press releases. And today they can do it directly to the public, of course, through Twitter, but they'll do that in ways that disincentivize additional research, or at the very least make it very easy for reporters and entities to simply say, here you go, public, here's what they told us. You should believe it too. Now, here's some strategies Herrick gives us. He says, in deciding what to believe, ask yourself, does the story conflict with well-confirmed background knowledge? Does it conflict with expert opinion? Is this source reliable? Is it backed by independent information? If you're unsure, can you compare the information in the report with information on the story provided by other news organizations? That's something I've recommended before. I want to recommend again. Is the story source credible and objective? Is the source biased? Oftentimes, news media today, they're going to be slanted in one direction or the other to appease their audiences. People tend to drift towards those news outlets that tend to what they want to believe. And so you need to think about that as a critical thinker. Do you really want to get your news that way? Is the reporter slanting the coverage? Most always in the shows that I watch, or news broadcasts I watch, perhaps giving some facts more attention than they deserve while ignoring or downplaying other facts that deserve a closer look. Would a more balanced look at the evidence lead to a different conclusion? Consult with competing sources. Matt's big recommendation. Merging reports from different news organizations might result in a more complete picture. I think that's the case very much, whether they're written sources or television sources or web sources. If you really care, look at different perspectives, and then you can piece together for yourself what makes the most sense and try to inform your friends and your family who only get their news from this perspective or that perspective. They're going to have a very incomplete view, and hopefully you can enlighten them in a friendly way, hopefully. Advertising. Ads target our emotions, of course, and our desires, where we're vulnerable, attempting to bypass our logical filters, which as critical thinkers will be able to fight against that. And ads, of course, use sex appeal. They promise beauty, wealth, success, contentment. I mean, just think of any of these commercials for what's that skin disease where you've got eczema, all these commercials where people are suddenly having this wonderful time in their life just because they've got this new skin pill or pills for you name it, any sort of ailment. The direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, I consider it very much shameful, and in many cases, it makes me wish I had this particular ailment so I could take that pill and then have a wonderfully fulfilled life, which is ridiculous, but that's what they're trying to tell us. Many cases, ads will stoke fear, insecurity, vanity, jealousy. Think about ADT or Simply Safe, how they overly inflate the risk of being burglarized or attacked. Think about financial scares about, oh, the markets are doing this, the markets are doing that. You better invest in gold, or that's a way to get at fear. Of course, vanity and jealousy. I love the new Genix commercials. There's a couple of screen captures here on your screen from Frank Thomas, the old baseball player, and I forget who that old football player is. Both of them playing golf. They make an illusion or some innuendo that if you take these pills, it's going to improve your virility. It's going to make you more appealing. It's going to make you more powerful. The question as a critical thinker is, are there any scientific backed tests that show that Nugenix actually improves or boosts testosterone? Well, I understand there are not. It's pretty much a placebo. You can look into that yourself, but they have this wonderful marketing machine and they try to hit guys in their ego and say, you need this. And they say, oh, by the way, she'll like it too, with a wink, with a guy standing over here beside his girlfriend or wife, and she's all giggling and sheepish. Come on, it's very, very much shameful. One thing you can do as a critical thinker to see how ads are trying to get to you is turn off the sound. Every once in a while, turn off the sound and just watch the ad, and then ask yourself, what are the message are they trying to convey? And then you'll be a little bit more immune to that. Do ads create desires is a question that Herrick entertains, or do they simply awaken and inflame dormant desires? Well, it really doesn't matter. The result's the same, is that dissatisfaction between where you are and that product. And that's been created. And that's something that also creates a lot of suffering because without that dissatisfaction, you might be just fine. You might be completely content. You may be happy already. You may feel successful already. Now, the broader cumulative message, and Harry doesn't say this, I'm going to say this, from all the ads we're constantly bombarded with, from those that show up in social media, those on television, those that you see driving down the road, those you hear on the radio, the cumulative message is you will be happy and possibly you'll only be happy through the purchase and the consumption of products. And that's a very sad message that our culture constantly bombards us with. And you need to think about and realize that this isn't something that's integral to the human condition. It's just something that's an artifact of our own immediate culture in this particular age. So, to the extent that you can realize you're being manipulated in that way, and that's just something that's built into your culture, for better or worse, will help you resist it somewhat. So, no reason at all to think that success, happiness, admiration, and contentment can only be yours through the purchase of products. In fact, think back to all the times that you've bought things thinking that they would, in fact, make you happy, successful, contented, and how you may have felt a momentary satisfaction, but how that quickly dwindled. And then perhaps you were thinking that new thing would give you that feeling, and you had it momentarily, and then, oh, now you needed something else. It's a hamster wheel, don't fall for it. We all fall for it a little bit, but be aware, fight against it. So the strategy you should take, be mindful of how ads are trying to manipulate you and ask yourself, would this pill, car, phone, food, gadget, purse, trip, service, truly make me happy, content, successful, fulfilled? Answer in most cases is probably going to be no. And there's another book, I didn't use a picture of the cover, but it's called Your Money or Your Life. And an argument that the author's making in that book is everything that you buy means you have to pay for it, which means you have to work to backfill that amount that you spent. And so the more things that you purchase, the more you have to work and the less time you have to enjoy those things and to enjoy life in general and to develop your talents and to grow and to spend time with those who you love and have cool adventures. So think about that. The less things that you purchase and the more that you can live within your means and diminish your desires for shiny new things, the more time you'll have just to live and have possibly a genuinely contented and enjoyable life. Advertising political. Herrick includes some specific things here about political ads, and it's good to see some examples. He mentioned, and these apply to all different ads, but hyperbole, that's over the top exaggeration. You hear this quite a bit in political ads in particular. Politicians will say, if we allow this bill to pass, it will be the end of freedom as we know it, or the end of American democracy. And this candidate would single-handedly plunge the nation into World War III. It could be the case, but usually it's just over the top exaggeration, both of those things. Ridicule, that's simply mocking an opponent. Sometimes this is called the horse laugh, where people will just belittle someone else, belittle a perspective. And what this does, it's an attempt to intimidate not only that person, but anyone who might also think that that perspective makes some sense. And it can be quite effective, but not as effective if you realize that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to scare you off of a position that actually makes sense simply through ridicule or the cue or the horse laugh. So she says she's for the people, sure, as long as those people are billionaires that donate to her campaign. That's not the best example of ridicule, but you know what I'm talking about. An innuendo, that's when you imply something, but you don't directly state it, you insinuate. And that's a way that politicians or anyone really can get away with saying some very untrue, false things about others that would make them legally liable and guilty of slander, but for the fact that they're not saying it directly. So they might say, for example, I've heard many say it's interesting how government contracts always seem to go to its biggest donors. So they don't come out and directly accuse. Instead, they say, I've heard many say it's interesting. That's innuendo. It can happen beyond political. Here's some other things, some different slants or some different ways to take neutral language and try to shape it in one direction or the other to try to subconsciously influence your audience. And we need to be aware of this so that we can fight against it and more objectively evaluate arguments and such. Emotive words are expressions that conjure up positive or negative feelings. And on the positive side would be a euphemism. That's a non-neutral language or term intended to sway our evaluation of something in a positive direction, or a dysphemism does the same in a negative direction. What we want as critical thinkers is neutral language, but here's some examples of dysphemisms, possibly neutral alternative in a euphemism. So you might say of a person who's older that they're senile if you're attempting to cast them in a negative light. You might say they're elderly, that could be neutral and somewhat respectful, or you could say that they're experienced. Perhaps that would be a euphemistic thing to say about the exact same person. You might say a person is miserly, comes to mind, the Scrooge comes to mind. You might say they're frugal. That's a bit of a positive connotation, but a little bit more neutral. If you were to say, however, they're financially savvy, that's definitely kicking over in the positive direction. If you called someone a war profiteer, that's negative for sure. You might say they're a military contractor. That might be more neutral or objective. But if you call them a national security partner, that definitely has a positive slant to it. These words have changed over time as this issue has progressed, but illegal alien still has a negative connotation to it. Some used to say that it was neutral, but it has more of a negative connotation today. An undocumented immigrant, some would say that that itself has a more of a positive connotation to it. But if you were to say instead that they're an economic migrant or an asylum seeker, that's a far more positive slant on the exact same person doing the exact same thing, whether you call them an illegal alien or an economic migrant. And so you can try to convince people of one thing or another with these terms that you use for the exact same person, exact same parties. The same thing happens in the gun debate. People who don't like firearms and they would see more restrictions will oftentimes call the exact same weapon an assault rifle or a sporting rifle if they'd like to defend them. Who doesn't like to sport? However, it's just a semi-automatic rifle in between. Perhaps it has a high-capacity magazine on it. But that might be what gives them reason to think we'll call it an assault rifle. It has a pistol grip and a high capacity magazine. But of course, the person who likes to use it to target practice or shoot deer would say it's a sporting rifle rather than just a straightforward semi-automatic rifle. The exact same money given to the exact same person for the exact same reason from the government might be called a handout if cast in a negative light. You might call it government assistance if you were trying to be a little bit more neutral. If you're trying to be very positive, you might call it economic justice. That's a positive slant for sure on the exact same thing. If you want to demonize the folks who work for the government, you might say that they're deep state bureaucrats. Bureaucrats, a long time insult for people who work for the government. Deep state's kind of a new one. Civil servants, much more neutral. Professional patriots, that's really trying to slant the same group in a very positive direction. Voter suppression, election procedures, or democratic security measures. Think about which type of person from which type of perspective would call the exact same thing one of those. And as a critical thinker, you want to ask yourself, what is it they're really talking about? Is it just election procedures? Okay, thank you. Now we can actually talk about the issue in an objective fashion. Gerrymandering, redistricting, or electoral boundary optimization. Ooh, man, they're really trying to get win one over on you if they're using electoral boundary optimization. But gerrymandering may be unnecessarily negative. Perhaps it's just good old-fashioned redistricting with some uh, judicial oversight, perhaps. When it comes to military encounters or operations, you might say If you're attempting to cast it in a very negative light, an invasion, a little bit more neutral could be a military maneuver, a peacekeeping surge. When you hear peacekeeping, in some cases they are legitimate peacekeeping operations, but if somebody's using that from the outset, it looks more like it's not so much to keep the peace, but to gain territory. It might be more of an invasion. Perhaps that's an appropriate term to use, but in any case, you want to evaluate the facts on the ground. How about this language slant your judgment one direction or the other? Here's an old classic one. Is he or she, is he a garbage man, a sanitation worker, which is a little bit positive, but also neutral, or a waste management professional? That's definitely in the positive direction. Slammer, jail, or restorative justice facility. Restorative justice facility? Man, that's over the top positive. And slammer is not as negative as it could be, but I can't think of a better one to put on in that category. Really, it's just jail or prison. And then last, the very much classic for sure. You get the point on this. If none of these other examples have, you got a clunker versus a used car versus a certified pre-owned vehicle. Which one is it? It's the exact same car. You calling it a lemon or a clunker, a used car, which is pretty neutral and straightforward, or a certified pre-owned vehicle, which sounds like a salesman trying to win. So think about all those different terms, euphemisms, dysphemisms, and neutral language. You want to seek neutral language as a critical thinker. Realize when people are trying to use that slanted language in one direction or the other so that you can be more immune to it. Think about all that other stuff in different ways that you can fight back against bias in the news media and advertising and also on the internet. Up next, we're going to take a look at deduction and induction. In fact, we're going to take a closer look than we have already.